Well, a few years ago, just after I came to Greenwich, I was called by a New York City wedding planner. And I was told that I was being invited to interview for a celebrity wedding. The wedding was going to be out in the Hamptons the following August. Now, truth be told, the wedding planner did not come out and say celebrity. They don't do that. She said something more along the lines of a prominent couple, or a couple in the public eye, or some other euphemism. But however it was that she said it, I caught her drift. Unfortunately, I was so curious about the celebrity part, however it was that she put it, that I did not give enough thought to the whole "you've been invited to interview" part. It's kind of a strange way to talk to a pastor. We pastors like to think of ourselves as the ones doing the interviewing, after all, trying to get a sense of a couple's readiness for marriage, looking for signs that indeed God has joined their lives. But I was intrigued, probably a little flattered, and so off I went into New York for the day, wondering who the mystery couple would be and hoping it would be someone that my mother and aunts had heard of. So I'll tell you the punchline now. I never did find out. In terms of the interview, I didn't make it any further than the lobby of the wedding planner's apartment building. The whole interview was there in in a New York building, the lobby that no one ever sits in? That was where we sat. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. She came with a list of questions. Was I okay with wearing a suit instead of a robe? By any chance, did I have a double-breasted suit? I'm not making this up. Was I familiar with how to work with a videography team? Operative word there, team. I thought I could probably figure that out. Was I okay with making the Apache wedding prayer a big part of the service in lieu of the traditional vows? Well, I have to kind of look at the prayer. Yeah, all right, yeah. So I thought she was gearing up to confirm that I would sign a non-disclosure agreement, which would have been fine. But it never got to that because I sank my whole adventure by asking my own question. I was not trying to prove a point, but since we were talking logistics, I thought it was important to ask when the couple and I would be able to meet for the premarital counseling. This stopped everything. "I'm sorry, what?" said the wedding planner. I tried to explain I wasn't fishing for secrets. I was trying to help them come to terms with what it would mean to be joining lives. And, the church has a lot that we kind of like to say about that. Now, it should have seemed funny, of course, needing to explain premarital counseling to a wedding planner, who is someone, after all, who plans weddings for a living. But these are strange times we live in. So I pressed ahead. "Well, in the church we see love as a holy mystery," I began. She cut me off right there. "I can assure you they are both highly spiritual people," she said, giving me a long look. Well, I could see that we were pretty much done. Nevertheless, I kept at it. She cut me off again. "Mr. Grant," she said, "I can see you're very attached to your way of doing things. Thanks so much for your time. Please send me your receipts for your travel and we'll be sure to reimburse you." And that was that. Now, looking back on it, I probably should have seen it coming. I hadn't. But you know what stayed with me longer was this whole window that I got into a world I'd scarcely known about, this world I'd scarcely knew existed, a world of handlers and assistants and multiple layers of insulation between people in the public eye and the rest of us. Those multiple layers that are put in place surely in part for their protection, surely in part for their best shot at privacy, or perhaps then also so that they can maintain a certain tone in their daily lives. A double-breasted suit kind of reverend. My glimpse into that world, brief as it was, made me feel like that could be a very hard and a very isolated way to live. On the other hand, this morning's parable reminds us not to be too sympathetic too fast. It reminds us that when push comes to shove, such a life would not be that hard in many respects. After all, the way Jesus tells it, the rich man lives quite well. Indeed, he is leading a fairly contented life, as a bold-faced name, living his days in a party-hardy kind of way, insulated by any number of layers from the rest of us, and from what we can tell, unrepentantly so. What's more, Jesus makes clear that this is especially insulated in the case of this particular rich man, because at his very gates, underneath his very nose, we're told there is a poor man named Lazarus who is suffering any number of indignities. The fact that Lazarus is named in the parable while the rich man is not should tell us where Jesus' own loyalties lie. Lazarus' sufferings are spelled out in aching detail, while the only specifics we get about the rich man are about his fancy clothes, his big meals, and his front gate. But then Lazarus and the rich man both die, and now the rich man is the one condemned to suffer. He looks up and sees Lazarus being comforted in heaven by Father Abraham. And the rich man hopes for mercy, just one finger dipped in cool water to ease the scorching heat of hell for even a second. And yet it probably comes as no surprise to us when he's told that a great chasm separates heaven and hell, and that any help from heaven is now impossible. In life, you see, the rich man enjoyed the many layers of separation between him and the rest of the world. But it turns out that in the process, he's been digging his own eternal chasm. And now there is no way back. And so part of what this morning's parable wants us to ask ourselves is this: are we building bridges? Or are we digging chasms? These are important questions for us. I can't imagine that anyone digs chasms on purpose, but we do put layers between us and other people. Sometimes it's important that we do that. For example, who hasn't made the mistake of taking a cell phone call in the middle of a much-needed vacation, only to get pulled into something that might easily have waited? Who hasn't been at a party and seen someone in particular across the room and felt like, I love them, but I'm just not up for it tonight? And so you sort of navigate behind the people, right? You're sort of over here by the plant or over here with the other people, and you're just sort of keeping tabs. we steer clear. We put those layers in place. Who doesn't regret having been pushed to say yes to something, knowing all along that we should have said no in the first place? So let's not suggest that layers between others and us are always bad, that they're bad in all circumstances. They're not. The problem is that if we're not careful, those layers can start to seem all too good. Returning to the parable, it isn't that the rich man is cruel. It's that he has become insensitive, or at least desensitized. And sure, maybe he always was. Maybe he's become so for some understandable reason. The story does not specify. There is simply the fact that here he is. And however much as he enjoys his comfort in life, it's clear that ultimately the rich man pays for having removed himself from life in general, and having removed himself from the life that is on his very doorstep. He pays for having chosen to live in a kind of contentment that Jesus ultimately finds to be false. The rich man pays for having placed so many layers of insulation between his life and the life of Lazarus. And the great tragedy of it, of course, is that it did not have to be that way. It was not supposed to be that way. God wants something better for us. And so again, what if instead of digging chasms, we committed our lives to building bridges instead? What if instead of screening things out, we commit ourselves to being people who notice? The story of the rich man is the story of someone who is literally hell-bent on preserving a very sad, superficial, and temporary way of living. But a deeper and more joyous and more enduring way is open to each one of us. And so this week, our gospel challenges us to be people who notice. It challenges us to reach out, to make time, to hear someone's story, to start building a bridge, even if it's only one, and even if it's only small, and even if it's just beginning. The gospel challenges us to pull away some of the layers we have put in place between our lives and the rest of the world. At the very least, it asks us then to notice the layers and to ask ourselves what it is we might be screening out in order to perfect that view. The gospel challenges us to remember that throughout his ministry, Jesus pointed toward a day when all the gates would be thrown open, and not simply the gates of every great house, but the gates of every human heart. Jesus imagined a day when the great banquet would not be some gluttonous exercise in self-indulgence, but a feast that welcomed all people. A feast where the greatest honor was not being the first one served, but the first to serve. That was his way of doing things. He was quite attached to it. And the question before us is if it will be our way of doing things too.